curious, compassionate, and rational people. In short, we believe that you can be good without a God. We are a very active organization, and we organize primarily through Meetup. So join us there to see our wide variety of upcoming events. We're an all-volunteer nonprofit, and we have many volunteer opportunities such as marketing, media and tech, membership, programming, social action, and you can learn more about all of these opportunities at the info table in the lobby. You can also go to our website, humanistsmn.org, to learn more and support us by becoming a dues-paying member. I wanted to share a few reminders about some special upcoming events. Coming up on Wednesday, May 1st, we're holding our Day of Reason event at the state capitol to advocate for the separation of religion and government. We're hosting a breakfast and a reception with guest speakers including Ron Millar from the Center of Free Thought Equality, Dipinder Singh Mayal from ACLU Minnesota, and legislators from the Secular Government Caucus. We encourage anyone who can to come. It's a very fun, exciting day, but it's also really important for us to come out in numbers to advocate for secular democracy. We will also be hosting a happy hour the night before at Moscow on the Hill in St. Paul, and Ron Millar will be speaking at that as well. And you can learn more about both events and register on our website. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Restrooms are out the door and to the left, or if you go downstairs, they're also to the left there. After the speaker and Q&A session, we'll be having our social hour in the lobby around 4:30. Please stay and socialize. We'll be providing food and drinks, and we encourage you to please consider contributing with a donation to help us cover our costs. There will be photos and video taken today that may be used for promotional and marketing purposes in the future. Up next, Stephanie Schwinn with our Humanists in Action team.
So good afternoon, everyone. As Ellie said, my name is Stephanie Schwinn. I am in the Humanists in Action Committee and also serve as the board secretary. Thanks for coming out on this beautiful day. Just a couple more announcements. We do have, some of you may have recall some of our billboard campaign that we have done as humanists here in the local area. You have an opportunity to support that statewide. Freedom from Religion Foundation is launching a national campaign of billboards to promote voting. If you would like to donate, you can reach out to the Grand Rapids Area Free Thinkers. They are partnering with FFRF for this event, and there are some flyers out on the back if you want more information. Also, just a little bit about Humanists in Action. We do a variety of social projects throughout the year, everything from reclaiming bicycles to doing quilts to hygiene kits, and of course, this being Earth Day, we have a lot of extra events coming up to celebrate Earth Day. On April the 27th, you'll have an opportunity to go and garden with Open Arms, which is an organization that helps to provide meals for people who are chronically ill. And we also have an opportunity on May 11th for highway cleanup. And as Ellie was saying, you can go to our meetup and you find a lot more information about the details as well as some other events that we are hosting. And so without further ado, I'll introduce Christine, who is going to talk about nominations.
Good afternoon, Christine Retqua. In addition to being on nominations committee this year, I am Humanists in Action co-chair. So every year we go through the process about nominations because there's almost always somebody up for re-election. And this year, the nominations committee would like to present the following slate of vetted and recommended candidates for our board of directors. Elections will be in May at our annual meeting. And after I say your name, it'd be great if you stood up and gave a little wave, let people know where you are. So these folks are up for election. Officers, President Ellie Haaland. Being nominated for a one-year term only in this case, because as next year she will have met the 8-year max of continuous service on the board. Per our bylaws, that means she must step down. We need to rotate and bring in new voices as much as we will miss Ellie in that role. So Ellie is the first candidate. The next candidate is Vice President Mitch Thompson in the back there on the audio and video board. Returning as vice president for another 2-year term, he has been on the board since 2019. So thank you to them. And next to our at-large board members, where there are 4 positions open. First is Abigail Jackson. There's Abigail. Yay, Abigail. Returning for another 2-year term, serving since 2022. And then also Audrey Kingstrom, who has served on the board, did serve on the board from 2011 to 2019, then rejoined the board last year, because you have that 8-year mandatory limit, after a 4-year hiatus, and now she filled an at-large vacancy and now is returning and up for election this time for a 2-year term. We have 2 more candidates to fill open seats. One is Sophie Lee. I don't think I see Sophie here. She is nominated for the first time for a 2-year at-large board position. She has hosted several events that some people may have gone to. Lovely human. And our final candidate is Paul Rupp, who is nominated for the first time for a 2-year at-large board position. So I want to give everybody a round of applause for being up for election and serving what they have done in the past, and have been fantastic leaders, and I look forward to the leadership of the new folks. So I will mention them. First, watch for more bios about everyone, so you will be informed as you are a voter. That's what we want people to do, is be informed voters. And per our bylaws, we will now accept any additional nominations from the floor. So let me ask, are there any other nominations that we should consider? Any other nominations? Any other nominations, as they do in the conventions? Seeing none, I guess that will stand. Of course, if something changes, they could reach out to Audrey Kingstrom. Yeah. Or anyone at the board. You can find our emails on humanistmn.org. All right, and any other who do arise between now and May, there will be further contact and vetting as needed. So let me now remind and clarify who are the current board members who are not up for re-election, so you know who represents you and who is guiding this organization. The current board members who are in the middle of their terms are officers John Walker, who is treasurer, and back there handling tech also, yay John, and Stephanie Schwinn, who, as she said, is secretary, yay to Stephanie, and 3 at-large board members, Suzanne Perry, I think is not here right now, and Jerry Smith, who is somewhere, there he is, and Nick Halen, I'm not sure, no Nick today, okay. So thank you to everyone. Let's give the existing who aren't up for election a round of applause. All right, thank you to everyone. As has been mentioned, we are a volunteer organization. We will happily take what time and effort you can and are willing to give. Whatever special talents you have, we would appreciate that. And now I will introduce Audrey Kingstrom.
Good afternoon, everyone. And I will say, for those of you who aren't serving on the board, which is most of you out there, is we have other wonderful volunteer opportunities and leadership opportunities. That's how this all-volunteer organization runs. So if you're interested in getting more involved, please talk to myself or Ellie or really anyone on the board. Before I introduce today's speaker, I do want to say that this ends our monthly speaker series for this program year. And next month at this time, although we will meet downstairs, it's the 3rd Saturday of May. I forget the exact date, I didn't write it down, will be our annual meeting. And you'll get to hear about what's going on in the organization. We will have an official election for the new board for the coming year. And you'll hear about what the board has been working on this year, some exciting plans for our organization going forward. We have had incredible growth in our organization this last year, and we have some exciting plans that we would like to discuss with membership. So maybe that doesn't seem as exciting coming to an annual meeting as another program, but I encourage you all to come and see how we can grow our visibility with humanism in our area, and how we can make this be a vibrant organization that meets our members' needs. So I encourage you to show up next month. And we'll have pizza. Did I say that? We'll have pizza. So to today's program, I'm very pleased to have with us today Jason Lukasik. He's Associate Professor of Education at Augsburg University. He's originally from Chicago, and Jason has an extensive background in out-of-school learning, museum education, and higher education. At Augsburg, he teaches coursework on curriculum theory, ecojustice education, and educational inquiry. He leads the Boundary Waters Teacher Institute, a summer program for teachers to study outdoor and experiential education. He also teaches an undergraduate coursework in environmental studies. Early in his career, Jason worked as a museum educator, leading a program for high school students at the Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago. I'm sure many of us have been there. That experience actually led to his dissertation research in examining the hidden colonial curriculum of zoo exhibits and activities. Since moving to St. Paul, Professor Lukasik appreciates that his work and love of the outdoors coincide, providing him ample opportunity to fish, paddle, hunt, and hike as he learns about the beautiful northern landscape of Minnesota, where you now I hopefully call Minnesota your home. And actually his family, his wife and 2 kids are with us here joining us today as well. And Lori tells me that she thinks she came to a humanist event a few years ago. Sadly, we don't have enough family programming yet, but that's one of the things we really aspire to. Anyway, please join me in welcoming Jason Lukasik today.
Right, thank you, Audrey, and thank you for the invitation to speak to you all this afternoon. I think we're, make sure this, I might need a pin. Promise I won't look. Cool. Thank you very much. All right, as Audrey mentioned, my name is Jason Michael Lukasik, and I work at Augsburg University. And I've been thinking since I started working at Lincoln Park Zoo, now that's quite a few years ago, about the interrelationship between human and ecological justice issues. So you know, some of my talk will touch on that. But first, Happy Earth Day. I say this with some hesitation, as I've always found it strange that by dedicating one day to Earth, is this to suggest that the other days we don't commit to the Earth? I suppose given our current state with global climate, human consumption, pollution, the answer to that question would actually be a firm yes. But my talk today is not meant to be a discussion of a list of things that you ought to do, you know, for Earth Day. I think this approach often fails to the work that that is necessary right now for the changes that we need to shift our overall human culture of impact on natural systems across the planet. I also want to acknowledge that we're on stolen land, though I also state this with hesitation, as acknowledging theft does little if that stolen property is not immediately returned. Anishinaabe author Patty Krovic says that we can't talk about restoring a relationship with land without talking about restoring it to the people from whom it was taken. We'll hear from Patty Krovic a little later in the talk. So today I'm going to talk to you about reclaiming the conscious soul of ecological struggle. I assume that we're all here as we're all invested in the work of ecological struggle to envision and live in an ecologically sustainable way. So why talk about reclaiming a conscious soul? The soul here refers to the immaterial, those things we cannot necessarily see or even know, but they are there. And the conscious refers to our human minds and how we come to make sense of the world around us. Now, this may seem like a tangential subject for an Earth Day talk, but I prepared this talk reflecting on an interview that I read with David Suzuki, the elder Canadian environmentalist and scientist, who, upon reflecting on his life of environmental activism and the movement, he's in his 90s now, he argued that the environmental movement has done a relatively good job of arguing specific issues and topics, arguing for better air quality, water quality, but has done a really poor job of changing culture. Many times discussions regarding the ecological crisis focus on some new, yet to exist or imperfect technology, a hope that we can continue business as usual and live sustainably. In fact, the Sunday New York Times 3 weeks ago, if you saw it, had an article right on the front page asking if we can engineer our way out of the climate crisis. So instead, I thought it would be worthwhile to take this time today for us to reflect on culture. The ecological crisis in which we find ourselves today may be best understood as a crisis of culture. Now, I did not necessarily know where preparing this talk would lead me. I view all writing and thinking as a journey, one that can't be simply captured in a predetermined outline, and instead it's one that's discovered along the way. So I made the road by walking in preparing this talk. So I invite you to join me on my walk as we ponder the ecological crisis as a crisis of culture and consider the ways that we might be able to push back against dominant culture collaboratively and humanely toward a more sustainable, equitable, and just life. Before we continue, just a few things I want to clarify. As I mentioned, I didn't quite mention this, but I'm not going to be talking today about averting a climate crisis or ecological crisis. That ship has unfortunately sailed. We find ourselves in the midst of that climate crisis. It plays out before us regularly. We just came through the warmest winter on record in the lower 48, as well as one of the warmest years on record across the globe. We witness increasing frequency of so-called 100-year storms, massive wildfires, increased flooding and drought cycles, weather events that are all correlated with a warming planet. If we wish to curb the damage already done, we need to examine the ways in which we might trouble the culture that got us here. Second, changing culture is not a simple concept. Culture is not a simple concept. And when I speak about changing culture, I'm generally referring to the dominant, Americanized, capitalist, neoliberal culture in which we find ourselves. There are many cultural practices across the globe that are far more sustainable than the dominant American culture, but this talk is not about presenting the correct alternative, there isn't just one, but considering how we might resist dominant culture and see our way through towards an alternative. And third, I'm an education and curriculum scholar. I'm concerned with what people learn throughout their lives and understanding how they come to learn those things. As such, this talk will draw from insights I've gained through my own experience, research, and teaching in the field of education and curriculum studies. And while I'm a scholar, I would not claim to be an expert in anything but my own life. I would assert this is the case for anyone. And so this talk also draws from my own life experience and journey. So, if the ecological crisis is a crisis of culture, let's first discuss what is meant by ecological. The term ecological can be both substantive and metaphorical. Ecology is the study of the interdependence of living things. So too, we can consider the ways in which the immaterial and material aspects of our life are interconnected. I considered how we might visualize in a simple way how these aspects connect, and so I created a Venn diagram. You can see it up there on the left, and maybe it's useful. My 12-year-old daughter was working on Venn diagrams in school, and so I think that concept stuck in my mind, so I decided I wanted to create one. So we could spend a lot of time examining all of these aspects in great detail as they pertain to the ecological crisis. I don't think we have the time or bandwidth, so I just want to touch on these quickly. So society, state, and politics. Essentially, how do humans organize themselves? At what level? What are the histories to this? I think here of colonialism and imperialism, racist policies, degrading land policies. Government regulations play a very important role, of course, with the likelihood of the Supreme Court overturning the Chevron deference, which empowers government agencies to regulate corporations. This is increasingly important to consider. The other part of the Venn diagram, paradigms of consumption. It's always important to acknowledge that we're creatures that must consume to live. Humans need to consume. All living things do consume. We need water. We manipulate raw materials to create shelter. We eat. All organisms, if they wish to live and contribute to the ecosystem, have to consume. But the question is, under what paradigm do we consume? Our human paradigm of consumption is probably best defined by settler colonial and industrial capitalism. We'll touch on those in a little bit. And finally, culture. How do we come to make meaning of the world that we live in? And what is our relationship to it? What ethics guide us? Now, all three of these aspects impact one another. For example, culture is shaped through capitalist consumerism. This is reified through governmental structures that encourage capitalist production. This, in turn, is reinforced by a culture of consumption that votes for capitalistic interests and engagement in marketplaces that may be damaging to the ecosphere. So let's dive a little bit deeper into culture. Jamaican-born British Marxist cultural theorist Stuart Hall argued that culture was, quote, shared meaning. So how does a community articulate a meaning around a concept, thing, place, group of people, etc.? And then how is that meaning later interpreted by others? In his work at the Center for Critical Cultural Studies at the University of Birmingham, Hall worked with colleagues to develop what they called the circuit of culture. This was an attempt to explain how one might study an artifact or text for its cultural significance. This was in 1997. They modeled it after examining a Sony Walkman cassette player as a cultural artifact. So, kind of dates it, right? And they identified 5 aspects in culture that you need to consider when studying any sort of cultural text or artifact. So representation, you could also say signification, identity, production, consumption, and regulation. And these are all interrelated, and they function, as they say, like a circuit. They continually connect with and inform one another. So representation and identity are typically the things that you actually see, when you look at an artifact. So representation is the way something is presented, as well as the meaning that is signified by that artifact. Identity is the way in which the artifact is situated in the broader social construct. Production is the way in which the artifact or text has been made, and then the consequential meaning that is produced. Consumption is the means through which the text or artifact is received, communicated, or otherwise taken in. And regulation, which is one of the more interesting aspects, refers to the ways in which an artifact or text is mitigated or controlled. For example, an artifact might be deemed taboo based on dominant cultural norms, or something becomes deemed normal or is normalized through that same process. So I wanted to share this just to reinforce the idea that culture, culture making, and cultural interpretation are all nonlinear, dynamic, and complex processes. Too often, when we speak of making cultural change, linear thinking prevails, and we seek that single variable to institute the change. So for example, we say, well, if people recycle more, one variable, then we'll end up with a more ecologically minded society. When in fact, cultural change is much more complex and requires a nuanced understanding for how knowledge and meaning is made. Borrowing from the spirit of Stuart Hall, who I mentioned earlier, is considered the father of cultural studies, we might suggest that we are products of that which we wish to change. In other words, we are enmeshed in cultural production, and we are all connected directly and indirectly to the anti-ecological cultural patterns we both need and want to address. And this is why I argue that ecojustice is an educational project. We need to consider not just what people know about the world and ecological sustainability, but how we come to think about these things. And so we might draw from Marx's theory of dialectical materialism to consider how knowledge is made and mitigated. And this is as deep as we'll get into the weeds, and then it'll become a little less dense. So we're continually presented with ideas, knowledge, and realizations, and then we mitigate the understanding of those things through our own histories, our socio-political locations, epistemologies, and paradigms. So a dialectic, on the right there, is simply a thesis confronted by an antithesis, which yields a new thesis, which is synthesizing those 2 points, right? Maybe you recall this from a college class or something. And this goes on, so on and so forth. This is a dialectic. It's ongoing, it's never ending. This was used by Marx to describe how history is made through a series of power relations. With Marx, it was between the capitalists and labor, so they confront one another, they're at odds, but what results is not one winning and one losing. What ends up happening is the formation of a new social relationship, a new synthesis. And that process goes on, and that defines the history of labor relations between workers and capital. And that dialectic can be applied to knowledge creation. People come together, we take those ideas, we filter them, and then we come up with some new understanding, but it's never like one side or the other, which might explain why we become so frustrated when it seems like the other side doesn't seem to fully get it, right? So if we go back to that Venn diagram, we could say that these three aspects inform that lens through which we come to understand and mitigate those new ideas. So we should note that the power that industrial capitalism as a concept has over how we think about the world and how we end up mitigating new knowledge. Even though capitalism is an unsustainable system propped up through inventions of new markets, that would be appropriate for another talk maybe, it often remains unchallenged as capitalism has become part of our worldview, a lens through which we end up mitigating new ideas. Critiquing capitalism as a root cause of the ecological crisis remains taboo. It's regulated. People, especially in the US, have deep connections with the capitalist system, and this is true. It's not like you can just easily opt out. But we need to maintain those critiques if we hope to imagine a different relationship to land and economy. So the consumption paradigm of capitalism has also been informed by a settler colonial mindset that determines relationships among people, place, and politics. Settler colonialism seeks to destroy in order to replace. So this is what I'll reference Patty Kravik again. So Patty Kravik is both Anishinaabe and Ukrainian. An author said that settler colonialism is the structure that has forced our histories into silos, that pulls us apart and created gaps so that we do not see the things that were happening at the same time. It also forces our identities into silos so that we don't see each other. It offers us identity without relationship. This is why culture is key to pushing back against the power that capitalism, as well as settler colonial thinking, has on influencing thought. While a dialectic does not mean one side wins and the other loses, there does remain a power dynamic, and it is not equal representation of both sides in the new thesis. An ethic or a conviction that rises above the material world can pose a challenge to the capitalistic rationale. Aldo Leopold, in his early studies of ecosystems in central Wisconsin, argued for the creation of a land ethic. He realized that an ethic promotes ethical actions. Conservation requires an ethic in order to stave off the desire to exploit, to compete, and accumulate. It is important to note that Leopold, like other white settlers, disregarded the knowledge of the people who were stewards of that same land for thousands of years, but his call for an ethic does acknowledge the complexities found in relationship with the land. Agrarian writer and tobacco farmer Wendell Berry is often credited by some generations as inspiring a back-to-land movement. He has long noted the problematic dominant culture that underpins the modern industrial agricultural complex. He said, quote, "Agriculture cannot survive long at the expense of the natural systems that support it." Berry recognized the importance of learning with and from the land one works. He spoke of the imbalance between centers of knowledge, such as universities funded by agribusiness, and the peripheries, like the local knowledge held by individual farmers, in this proliferation of industrial agriculture. Now, we see this pattern continuously, where knowledge on the periphery, from the margins, is routinely disregarded in favor of the centers. This is part of the settler colonial underpinnings of the, quote, American way. While not outwardly engaging in anti-colonial protest, Wendell Berry did seek to critique dominant cultural patterns that prioritize capitalistic competition and individualism over a sense of community, viewing the land as a raw material resource as opposed to a life-giving entity. And there are parallels between this back-to-land movement, the back-to-land folks who followed the wisdom of Wendell Berry in roughly the 1970s, the 90s, and contemporary environmental discourse that looks to indigenous knowledge systems to better understand relationships to the land. But as a white scholar working within dominant paradigms of settler colonialist ideologies, it is important to turn to specific knowledges and then position oneself as a learner and visitor, embracing an epistemology of humility. Wendell Berry and his colleague Wes Jackson of the Land Institute have even argued for a sort of positive ignorance, recognizing that what we do not know always outweighs what we do know. And the we here should be clarified as the settler colonial mindset, who has limited knowledge of the local land. It is our obligation, the descendants of white settler colonialism, to engage in dialectic discourse with other knowledge systems to better inform our emergent relationship with land. One of these different knowledge systems is that of something called concentric ecology, which was developed by Enrique Salmon, a member of the Tarahumara tribe in Mexico. Concentric ecology posits that human inquirers share a relationship with all things in the ecosphere that are being studied. A kincentric approach may not change the subject studied, but it changes the questions that are asked. Enrique Salmon has suggested that in many indigenous languages, there is no word for wild. The concept of wilderness, or a place that is apart from humans, is not one that makes sense following that logic. So let's hear from Enrique Salmon in an interview he gave regarding his recent book, Iwigara, The Kinship of Plants and People.
We look at the land and everything on the land, especially plants, as relatives, that they're directly related to them, just like our human relatives, like our aunts and uncles. And I can't remember who first used the word kinship, but then about the same time we realized, yes, it's a kincentric relationship, that everything's focused on family, and that, we're related to each other, sharing breath. That when we exhale, we're exhaling carbon dioxide, we're exhaling things that the plants especially like to inhale. And then they play a direct role in providing nutrients for us, oxygen and food and so on. And so it's this really unique, powerful and important relationship that I was hoping other people would recognize. We are in constant direct connection with things like plants. They are our relatives, and in a lot of ways we are those plants. And those plants are us, because we share this concentric relationship through breath, through energy, through, if you want to think of that as soul, or spirit. And so when I was invited by Timber Press to write the Iwigara book, that's this whole idea of what I mentioned before about sharing breath. That's what iwi means, is breath. Because you notice in the subtitle, it's the kinship of plants and people. And I was trying to, in the book, make it more than just like a dictionary of names of plants and how to use the plants, and here's the Latin name, and here's how the native peoples refer to it. I wanted to tell the stories of the plants and bring them to life, because that's how, as native peoples, we first look at the plants, and it's also how we share knowledge about different plants through stories. And then as you read the book, you'll see stories a lot of times for each of the plants, and that's the best way, I think, to get an idea and connect to the plants and learn about them. That's how, as a native person, I was taught about plant knowledge. It was always through stories. It was never just, like my grandmother would never, for example, just say, okay, today we're going to learn about this plant. Tomorrow we'll learn about that plant. It was more like she would be in this arbor that my grandfather had built out of pieces of wood, but it was all covered with vines and so on. And it was inside there where it would be 10 degrees cooler sometimes because it was so shaded. And she would be processing the plants that we collected earlier, grinding them or drying them or whatever. And while I was helping her do that, she would tell me stories about the plants. And over time, as I was growing up, that's how I learned about plants from my grandmother, my mother, my grandfather. I helped him in our cornfield, and helping with the beans and other things that we were growing. And so anyway, that's why I wrote the book in such a way.
So Enrique Simon mentioned the importance of learning through stories. So taking a cue, I wish to share with you some stories of resistance and experience that may help us to collectively think through cultural shifts, a cultivation of a land ethic, and revitalizing relationships among people and land. So first, story of Luna the whale. So in 2001, a lone orca who came to be named Luna appeared in Nootka Sound in British Columbia, Canada. The orca, who had become separated from his pod or family, drew the attention of tourists and boaters, the local First Nations tribe, the Mowatchit, as well as the Canadian Fisheries Department. What followed was a fascinating study of contradictory epistemologies. The orca, who the Mowatchit named Sukit, had a propensity for approaching people in the sound, and this put him at risk of being harmed or killed by the motorized boats in the area. The Canadian Fisheries Department, in an attempt to reunite Luna with its pod, sought to capture the orca and move it to the open ocean where it believed the pod might be. This strategy had been done successfully with another lone orca who's named Springer, but it does come with risks. If the orca does not willingly join the pod, it would likely end up being put into captivity for its own safety, as it may not survive on its own. It can be really disruptive to it when they try to relocate at such a distance. Now, this plan was complicated by the fact that 2 days before Luna appeared in Nootka Sound, the Mowatchit chief, on his deathbed, said he wished to return as an orca whale. You may know that some First Nations people in the Pacific Northwest have great reverence for the orca. To the local Mowatchit people, Luna, or Sukit, was their reincarnated chief. A public debate ensued. The First Nations people wished for Sukit to decide for himself where he went, and vowed to protect him as best they could. The threat to Sukit was largely from the non-Indigenous driven powerboats, people in the area who might not be aware of the local wildlife and the lore attached to that wildlife. Michael Harris, then president of the Orca Conservancy, took kind of a nuanced approach in seeking a resolution. He requested the Department of Fisheries take action to reunite Luna with his pod, but with the inclusion of the First Nations people. The Canadian Fisheries sought to utilize their best science to reunite the orca, and it's important to note, orcas have a complex and important social family structure, and these are needs too. So in general, orcas are dependent upon having a family and pod. But the fact remains, there we go. The fact remained that this particular orca held a special significance to the Mowatchit people. The issue came to a head when the Fisheries Department just decided to go out and capture Luna, but the Mowatchit people paddled traditional canoes and sang songs and lured Sukit to their treaty territory, and it ended up becoming a stalemate. As is often the case, the First Nations perspective was minimalized. The Christian Science Monitor, in an editorial, put it this way: quote, "Killer whales may well be important in native mythology, and there are more things in heaven and earth and all that. But Sukit is not a mythological whale. He's a real one, perhaps a simple, we're sorry we stole your land, but the whale needs its pod is in order." Sukit unfortunately died in 2006, killed by a boat propeller. The significance of the story is important to note. What entailed was a public discussion that revealed the ethics that underpin action. While the Canadian fisheries possess knowledge that is helpful in protecting individual orcas, the ethic that guided the actions of the Mowatchit people provided another way of thinking about conservation. As David Suzuki, who I referenced earlier, he said in relation to the issue of Luna the whale, "If a mountain is deemed a deity, it will never be mined for ore. So on a pragmatic level, an ethic that values some things as sacred means it will be protected regardless of the knowledge, scientific or otherwise, that we learn about it." Now, I'd like to think that if this were to happen today, there would be much more support for the First Nations perspective. In fact, there is currently an orphaned orca right now who's been located in a British Columbia lagoon. You can Google orca British Columbia, it'll come up. The First Nations people, not the Moachit, but another band under that tribe, are currently working closely with the Department of Fisheries to capture and relocate the orca to a safer location. So a lot has changed in the past 20 years, and there is an increased awareness of and appreciation for the power of native science, or also known as traditional ecological knowledge, especially when it pertains to place-based conservation and management decisions. But this has not been due to some sudden awareness on the part of the white settler colonial benevolence. It has come as a result of concerted and organized efforts by Indigenous people and allies to bring Indigenous perspectives into the broader narratives. So this fight has been working, but there's still a great deal more work to be done. So while the story of Luna is sad, it is worthwhile to note that some critique can be joyful. Culture jamming. Culture jamming is a subversive form of protest, often against corporations, to identify the contradictions in which we're immersed, to provide counter or taboo narratives. This is all about pushing back on the regulation aspect of the circuit. So in 2016, and then later in 2022, Robin Greenfield, who's a minimalist environmental activist, engaged in a month-long experiment where he consumed, as an average American would, and wore the trash he generated. He used the trash suit he carried as a means of engaging the general public about the tremendous amount of trash produced by individuals in the US. That's an average of 4 pounds of trash and recyclables per person per day. Now, a quick Google search can find numerous accounts of individuals who have sought to reduce their own individual trash impact. Some folks have successfully gone to zero waste, at least for a certain amount of time. And the experience of doing this, carrying around trash produced for a day, a week, a month, can be highly informative. I highly encourage you to try it. Just grab a bag, everything that you accumulate, carry it with you. You'll see how much trash you accumulate. But the performance of doing it, so putting it out there, not just doing it for yourself, can provoke and impact, albeit slowly, the broader consumer culture. So I want to share with you 2 culture jammers who continue to inspire me and my outlook. The first is Reverend Billy. He's a performance artist in New York City who has used his street evangelist character to raise awareness about critical local and global environmental issues. He was the subject of the documentary What Would Jesus Buy? And he's a leader of the Church of Stop Shopping. Reverend Billy routinely preaches in public spaces to exorcise the demons of cash registers. He will protest corporate consumerism. He did make an appearance at the Mall of America. And he laments environmentally degrading practices. So I just wanted to play a little bit of Reverend Billy talking about trees.
$404, $449. Numbers. Can you hear me? I know there's information. I know there's a story coming into my fingers. The witnessing of life here, going back so many decades. The stories are right here. You were a sapling here at the beginning, and then you had the patience to live with people and observe us, and now your value is square footage of the land where you happen to be planted, the Riverview luxury tower apartments that they can plunge into the clouds above. We know now that these are conveyors of information. All of this, the roots, the stems, the flowers, the leaves, the branches in the wind, all conveying, talking and listening in a community, in a language that we don't understand. But now we know that this is all alive with storytelling. And it seems to me that what they're doing here is what they also try to do to us as consumers. When they come down on us With 10,000 advertisements every day, they try to divide us into little categories and labels, issues, process us so that we are no longer conveying information. We are only just pure value, just money, monetized. But those stories, those unique observations, the living life that these trees that are still standing here, they are listening. All of us in this neighborhood, the people, the children in these buildings, we all appreciate your shade and the life that you gave us. And then we know that you will continue to live. And we will find a way to meet in the middle as we adopt, as we talk to the earth.
All right, so note that Reverend Billy spoke of being isolated by the corporate consumer culture, similar to how Patty Kravick talked about settler colonialism placing us in silos. Next up, the yes men. There we go. So some of you may be familiar with the yes men. They are known for creating fake campaigns and websites to, in their words, meddle with corporate powers. One of their more highly publicized hijinks involved creating a fake website for the Dow Corporation, Dow Chemical, and then ended up being invited by the BBC as a representative of Dow Chemical to speak to the anniversary of the Bhopal chemical disaster. For those of you who don't know, the Bhopal disaster was a catastrophic chemical accident in 1984 that saw 500,000 people exposed to a highly toxic gas after a Union Carbide chemical plant leaked due to poor management and oversight. Death tolls are debated, but they range from the 3,787 official number to over 16,000. Over 500,000 people were injured. Dow Chemical purchased Union Carbide in 1991. Now, in the prank, one of the yes men, seen here, appeared as a representative of Dow Chemical and promised that the corporation, on BBC, promised that the corporation would take responsibility for the disaster and pay for health costs and community rebuilding. Of course, this wasn't the case, but Dow's stock plummeted. It did rebound once it came out that it was a prank. But the hijinks did something pretty important. It forced Dow Chemical to come out on the record and say that they would not apologize to the people of Bhopal. They would not commit to the monies necessary to repair the damage done. And it also exposed the gross negligence of the stock market, which always prioritizes profit over doing the right thing. So that's one of the more famous examples of culture jamming. They recently have put out an ad campaign, and it's designed to be a play on the types of medication that are available on the For Hims and For Hers websites. Maybe you've seen them advertised. And so they have a new product that they're advertising called Disonex.
Extreme heat is just the latest in a series of
witnessing worst-case scenarios.
Work has never been easy, but these days, putting bread on the table can mean contributing to the world's problems. Life clouds us with contradictions. Faced with mixed signals, how do you sleep at night?
Dissonance.
With Disonex, I get to excel at my work and sleep at night.
Disonex is the first neuroinhibitor to treat the dissonance we feel when our ethics clash with our ambitions. As civilization marches forward, every choice can seem dark. But Disonex disrupts that process. Tiny acrobats dance across neural pathways, maintaining our ability to function under competing pressures of modern life. Guilt melts away, making a cozy bed for contentment. Disonex was first developed by military scientists to help prevent PTSD. In the catch-22s of battle, Disonex blocks trauma before it gets triggered. But in today's workplace, it's not only soldiers who have to make hard choices.
I use Disonex to ease confusion when I can't avoid being part of the problem.
Some investments I manage have climate effects, but I can assure my clients only happy returns with Disonex.
I love the woods. But with this and X, I can see the forest for the trees.
If the dissonances of modern life get you down, ask your doctor if dissonance is right for you. Dissonance. How do you sleep at night?
Side effects may include nausea, dizziness, drowsiness, diarrhea, constipation, loose stools, clogged stools, dry mouth, drooling, flushing, sweating, rashes, thirst for urine, difficulty breathing, palpitations, swelling of the lips, tongue, or anus, difficulty focusing, memory loss, and cognitive impairment.
So you can go to, I think it's the yesmen.org, and join their campaigns, see many of their other campaigns that they've engaged in. Now, while comedy can provide a powerful means of critique and can certainly shift the way we think about the complexities of environmental degradation, corporate manipulation, capitalistic greed, and failures of government regulation, ultimately major cultural change rests upon broader movements that call out social injustices across human and ecological lines. For example, I think of the water protectors, a local example, and their work fighting the Dakota Access Pipeline. We should regularly look to knowledge in the periphery or margins for insight into making meaningful change. As Audrey mentioned before I entered academia, I was an educator at Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago. The nature of my work centered on working with public high school students from marginalized communities across the city. In the Chicago area, there has and continues to be a concerted effort to protect prairie habitat. Prairie and wetland defines the Chicago native landscape. This photo is of the James Woodworth Prairie, a very small but well-preserved 5-acre tract of land in the northwest suburbs of Chicago. Actually, it's really healthy prairie for Chicago, where there isn't much left. At the zoo, and this was true of other environmental organizations that were committed to education, there was a great deal of emphasis on teaching local youth about prairies. Learning about their biological importance and the need to protect and restore them. The assumption, though, was that many of these youth, because they had no direct experience with prairies, needed to be told everything about prairies. Now, when I was working at the zoo, I'd been reading something called the Slang Urban Dictionary, which is a dictionary that provides insight into regional dialect. And I noticed an entry for the Chicago area, and it was prairie, but it referred specifically to vacant lots, often in poorer neighborhoods. What I realized in that moment was that kids, or anyone who was using that slang term, were actually quite familiar with the overall concept of a prairie. They may not have known about the specific species that should be found in a healthy prairie, but they had a conceptual start. So I started changing my approach. Instead of talking at my students, thinking that they had to learn this knowledge, I started drawing upon the knowledge that they already had. To explore the interconnections between human and ecological justice. So in my work, we took city youth on outdoor trips throughout the city, paddling the Chicago River, don't fall in, it's much dirtier than the river here, hiking in forest preserves, connecting their innate knowledge of place, so what they already knew, with the natural wonders that could be found among the concrete maze of Chicago. So for example, one of the things we ended up doing, we explored the concept of habitat loss, which is a major theme if you go to any zoo, talk about habitat loss. It's a threat to biodiversity. But instead, we started with my students reflecting on habitat loss in their own neighborhoods. This was a time when Chicago was experiencing a lot of gentrification, and so they looked at habitat loss as a form of as a threat to cultural diversity, and then connected it to the habitat loss in the wild as a threat to biological diversity. And that enabled us to explore the underpinning economic systems that led to both phenomena. So human and ecological issues are inextricably linked. So fast forward to my present day work with teachers. For the past 3 years, this will be the 4th summer this year that we do this, I've led a program called the Boundary Waters Teacher Institute. The Institute takes practicing educators on a week-long immersive trip to the Boundary Waters Canoe and Wilderness area. Now, I invite students who attend the BWTI to share their own insights and sometimes potentially lead their own activities during the trip, just as they are inclined to. Our work together becomes an emergent journey, a quest for meaning in community with one another. So this has led some students showing others how to fish, sharing knowledge about constellations that they might have, or just sometimes leading conversations around the campfire. On the trip last year, one of my students, who's Anishinaabe, led a smudging workshop and then demonstrated her indigenous knowledge by leading classmates to forage for native foods in the forest. Given that her ancestry tied her to that land, very specifically that land, the pedagogical implications were immensely powerful. Now, this was not planned, but emerged in the moment based on the knowledge that that student brought. So we tend to think about education as imparting specific knowledge and skills, right? This often is the case with environmental education. When I take students to the Boundary Waters, they learn important technical skills. I can say with confidence, for example, that they will be better canoe paddlers after the trip. We spend time learning how to stern a canoe, how to efficiently portage. We teach them various paddling techniques. They learn how to take care of a campsite, how to manage gear, how to orienteer. The range of experience of students who go on this trip, some are novices, some have never camped before, some could probably lead the trip themselves. But all of these skills that they learn are secondary to the experience of wonder, joy, and challenge that people have in a place like the Boundary Waters. Paddling is important, but it's not as important as seeing, observing, feeling, and sensing the beautiful world around them. So paddling, or the activity, becomes the vehicle used to achieve far more meaningful outcomes, outcomes that are born out of the experience. And they're not predicted and maybe not even fully known. I like to think that my work with teachers is helping to cultivate an ethic of care for one another and the planet. I sometimes joke that we eat together, we bathe together, we sleep in the same place, and it's an ultimate test and experience of experiencing your full humanity, right? The full measure of humanity. You can't really put on any sort of, cover or shield. You come as you are when you're in the woods. And so we do this with joy and wonder exploration. We do it with humility and not knowing. Teachers return from the woods with optimism and hope, and I like to harness that hope and energy to connect the myriad issues before us, human and ecological. So we're in a tremendous need of a new land ethic, one that privileges marginalized perspectives, one that is premised on humility, one that expects equitable sacrifice. The underpinning dominant culture of consumption, capitalistic greed and growth, and individualism is contradictory to one of ecological harmony. It is also antithetical to issues of humanism, equity, and inclusion. So what would it look like to envision a world where people and places are kin? This is the culture we need to hold on to and in order to develop a new land ethic. So I know I've presented a lot here, quite a bit, and we're winding down on our time here. So I'll try my best to boil this down into a few main points. So one, ecological justice is an educational project that we all contribute to, not just educators or teachers. We're all engaged in learning and teaching through our choices, our actions, our engagement with the outdoors and others. I encourage all in this room to learn about local efforts and struggles, to align themselves with them, not as an expert, but as a learner. I'm relatively new to Minnesota, having lived here for 8 years, and I continue to learn about the local efforts. For example, learn about the exciting work at Wonkan TP, located at what was the Bruce Vento Nature Reserve in St. Paul. The Dakota are reclaiming and rehabilitating land, and by doing that, reclaiming with it the soul of that place. 2, cultural change is complex. It's not a linear journey. Ecojustice is a perennial struggle. There's no promised land at which we will arrive. It will require continual work, deliberation, cooperative learning, and experience to continue to shape the world in the way we wish to live in it. We actively contribute to shaping culture, and we are actively shaped by it. So pay attention to the role of culture in addressing the ecological crisis. How are ecological issues interconnected to other issues of justice? And what are the paradigms, ideas, and values that underpin your actions in this world? And finally, it is important to embrace being on the margins. Clearly, sustainable living and eco-justice lies on the margins of society. Critiquing capitalism is taboo, but the margins provide the answers we need. Those most oppressed by the dominant systems provide the greatest insights into how to change it. Broader cultural change requires that we consider the interrelationship between human and ecological justice issues. Social movements start at the margins and are sustained through them. So there is joy in this work. I've seen it in the Boundary Waters and the critical humor of Reverend Billy and the Yes Men. It thrives in debate and protest. There's joy found in kinship with people and with place. And in that spirit, together, we might find the soul of ecological living. Happy Earth Day, everyone.
I have to turn something on here. Did I do it? Did I do it? I didn't hold it long enough. Hello, hello, hello. Hello.
You just turned it on. Okay. Let me turn it up back there.
We're gonna have, there it is. We're gonna have Q&A now. And thank you so much, Jason. That was really powerful. At least I found it so. Anyway, we're gonna have Q&A. If you wanna sort of line up over here, please try to keep your commentary to actually limit your commentary and keep it to a question. And let's give Jason the floor while he's here, because he's a wealth of knowledge and perspective that I think is very useful. So anyway, line up over here for questions, and try to keep it to one question so we can get through as many people, and then if there's time, you can come back again. All right, I see John is ready to go.
Thank you for your presentation today. So my question is in regards to, I guess, rights to lands and things like that. For me, I believe we're all bound by the same gravity of this earth. We all breathe the same air. We're all in the same, environment, ecosystem. Shouldn't it be that nobody owns a right to any land, that we all share this land? It should all be public land. And so therefore, we should, embrace the science and as a majority, make the decisions that is for the greater good.
Yeah, I think right on, I agree with you. I think that would be ideal. I think, it's taken me some time to kind of come to this point, and I think it's been learning about how people end up thinking through things. And I think we see it right now with the political climate, where it's incredibly divisive, right? And we just wish we could convince the other side to think as we do. But if we recognize how thought emerges, right, and then also how powerful those points are, right? It isn't just that we can provide the evidence and people will just naturally make a logical conclusion. I think we could potentially get there. That would be the type of radical change, right? Reorienting how we see land. But the way in which we've come to see land, right? We, meaning, right, capitalism, right? Sees land as this resource that's meant to be exploited, used, as opposed to something that shouldn't be owned, right? Should be just shared, trying to revitalize commons. We can even ask ourselves right now, like where are there even commons now? Right now in the Twin Cities, are there really any commons, right? We could say like a public park, but you get kicked out after a certain time, right? That's not how things are set up. But I think then the question is, well, how do we get there? And we could look at, prior to colonization, right? Pre-European arrival, land had people who were here had a very different relationship with land. It wasn't something that was owned. And that could be something that we could try to get back to. That would be ideal. But even a strategy that's been utilized by Native tribes is now looking to treaties in order to assert their rights. And while the treaties weren't ideal, this started with the Maori in New Zealand. They started going back to problematic treaties that were unjust to begin with, but they were realizing that they didn't even have access to things that were actually promised to them under the law of the colonial government. And so then they are now using that to assert their right. And I think it's a question of that can be a step in that direction. right? So then if indigenous folks are able to assert how they want to manage the land as promised under a treaty, then the question of how that becomes instructive. I mean, ideally, yes, that should be a goal, right? To not see land in that way. But I think it's also a question of understanding why people have learned to associate land as a resource. And then thinking about all those ways in daily activity where we're engaging with that realization that land is a resource, right? You go to the grocery store and you buy things produced by the land in this capitalistic system. And that reinforces subtly that idea that land is just a resource to be exploited, right, and owned. So I would say, yeah, like we should be trying to get there. But I think it's also recognizing how complex it is, you know, and I think realizing in some ways then that can become a bit of a resource that you can end up using, right? If you know that people like understand how people have come to identify land as something that is owned, is private, then use that to try and exploit it, you know, and maybe you should contact the Yes Men. There could be an ad campaign that could be done with ownership of land, right? I mean, I often think, you know, there are ways to play around with, and this is culture jamming. So when people come out against socialism, then you highlight, you know, you could even say, yes, down with socialism. So we're going to get rid of fire departments that show up when you call 911, right? Because that is socialism, right? And so identifying some of the hypocrisy, right? And so I think with land, it can also become part of that as well, right? How do we, and that's the culture jamming stuff. How do you take some of the contradictions that are inherent in the dominant cultural, you know, narrative and then use it against itself, right? And so I think that could be certainly something that we should be working for, right? Thank you.
So you mentioned the Chevron case. It's coming before the Supreme Court, and based upon my observations of the Supreme Court, I have a pretty good idea of how they're going to rule. How concerned are you that they're going to rule the way that probably a lot of us in here think they're going to rule, in terms of perhaps something like getting rid of the EPA entirely, or companies going back to being big polluters just because they can? How concerned are you that that could become a reality?
I'm terrified. And I think you're starting to see, you know, there is a tendency in academia to like, you don't want to be the, you know, the alarmist. And you see that still today with a lot of climate scientists who still, you know, take a reasoned approach and say, well, we can still meet the 1.5, right, degrees Celsius, which evidence suggests we won't, right? We've already potentially passed that, right? That was the 1.5 degree threshold we had for warming, where things would be, you know, bad but not horrible. And I think you're starting to see more climate scientists come out expressing how fearful they are, right? About how bad things are getting. And I think that decision is going to be really problematic on multiple fronts. I mean, I think the current Supreme Court is also eroding its own legitimacy, right? You have a specific, right? Clarence Thomas should be recusing himself from numerous cases, given the influence and his relationship with donors. But then I look to, right, like that's the government, that's the state, and I wonder, well, how did we get here? And I think a lot of that is the culture, right? And so, you know, recognizing how those things, that's why I created that Venn diagram, right? I was thinking about how do these things interrelate? And I think there is something about cultivating an ethic, right? A culture that would prohibit that sort of action from the Supreme Court, right? That could potentially lobby legislation that would reinstate those sorts of protections, right? Because that Supreme Court, what I understand about that decision, right, is that it means that you don't have to have specific legislation, but that agencies can regulate based on a good interpretation, right? And that Chevron deference, if they overrule that or overturn it, will basically kneecap a lot of regulatory agencies, right? And that would be the fear. And despite all of the ad campaigns that corporations put out, they're just trying to make profit, right? That's what they do. And so we shouldn't be surprised that that's what's going to happen. So I try to look towards the, let's not be surprised by it. So then how do we try to shift culture, right? How do we shift the ethic where that isn't tolerated, right? What would that look like? And I think a lot of things would have to change, you know, and recognizing that also, I think and this is why I like to connect human and ecological issues, is that often the environment, even though it is incredibly important, because it may not directly seem to relate to people's day-to-day life, that they don't see that as an issue, but they're concerned about things like healthcare, which should be provided, right? Single-payer healthcare, right? Though that, I see that becomes an environmental issue, because if we were to push for single-payer healthcare, that would then allow people to not worry about healthcare and instead focus on some of the other issues, right? When people have developed, like if you saw, like people were generally becoming more concerned about environmental issues when we had all of the wildfire smoke. When people saw wildfire smoke in the cities impacting their day-to-day life. That's one of the challenges with environmental issues, is we don't always see the day-to-day, right? If you have a health scare and you can't afford it, it's real, right? Then you see the issue with healthcare, right? It's a direct experience. And that's where I think the importance of an ethic means that, right? And an ethic is supposed to be this guiding principle, right? So that, you know, and that's where I even think like that. I really appreciated when David Suzuki talked about Luna and said, well, look, let's be pragmatic in the conservation movement. If a mountain's a deity, nobody will mine it. That just is completely off the table. So I think about those things. What are those things that become our ethic, right? That companies, no matter what, right? Companies cannot harm the resources that they rely on, right? That we rely on. You know, how does that become the ethic that guides action? Because then I think it becomes a lot easier to hold people accountable, companies accountable, not just legally, right? I mean, that's one avenue. And with the Chevron deference being overturned, that might remove one of those avenues. But there are other avenues to try to exert pressure, I guess is the way I would think about it. But I'm terrified.
So I was recently Googling about the movement of populations from rural areas to urban areas, which I think a lot of people know is like, you know, very much the pattern right now. So I was curious if you had any thoughts about, with an increasingly urbanized population and fewer people living in rural areas, how do you see that playing into the goal of increased kinship with nature and culture change in that direction?
That's a really good question. And I think it's also, I mean, there is the idea of rethinking what nature is, right? And this is where these cultural patterns and cultural narratives become so overwhelming and difficult to transcend. So, I mean, I take students to the Boundary Waters, but we shouldn't have to drive 4.5 hours to appreciate that sort of beauty of paddling, right? At the same time, it's really tremendous to have that as a resource, to be able to go there, to see it, right? It's a cool experience. It can be transformative for people to see what a lake looks like without development, right? Like you don't see that very often. But at the same time, we need to transform what we mean by nature, right? What we mean by wilderness, right? And I think that's also kind of questioning and living with that tension too. It doesn't mean that we don't go to the wild, but how do we bring the wild to where we are, right? And I do think there are some exciting ideas that you see in urban planning, and those they're going to cost a lot of money. I mean, that's the reality, right? They're going to cost a lot of money, and it's money that since 1980, that was when neoliberal practices really started coming into play in the U.S. As well as UK, starting in 1980, right? So we're looking at 40 years of moving money from government entities, right? Who, in many ways, the government can represent a commons, right? At least in terms of funding, moving that all to privatization. So I think that's, like, it's a question of also appreciating how that issue of rethinking, right, how we might organize a city, recognizing what has already been done in terms of policy. So things are privatized, right? There isn't much left in terms of state, apparatuses, right, that are fully public funded, because they've been moving away from that, right? That was a way to create new markets. And I think the more that we can do to connect with those things and see how, say, moving towards reclaiming public space as real public space, and maybe even, rethinking or challenging some of the tendency to do the public-private partnerships, right? Maybe those still go through, but really questioning them and making that part of the discourse, right? It's, and that's the idea of a dialectic, right? I mean, nothing will change if we don't raise it, but we can't necessarily expect that we're going to raise it at a meeting and all of a sudden everything will change. I mean, well, we could expect that, but that would be authoritarianism, right? I mean, that's, right? So recognizing how thoughts do change, it takes a lot of work, right? And it's also going to be completely uphill. But that's going to be something that we're going to have to keep considering, like what does it look like in urban areas? And increasing urbanization has been happening for a long time, but you're also seeing a shift, and I don't know, maybe some of this will calm down a little bit. With the pandemic, there were a lot of people who had the means, started moving and buying up big properties, right, and being able to telecommute or whatever, and have, luxurious homes out in the rural areas. Maybe that will change, back, I don't know. But there also are, I've seen some cool, exciting proposals about, more, like solar panels or solar arrays that are on block by block bases, right? So even rethinking our relationship to big structures, right? If we, it's the next best thing to carrying around your trash with you. What if, like, blocks had to manage their own garbage or something, right? Or you broke up landfills. A lot of landfill stuff gets shipped out, right? Or trash. I think I'd read, a lot of the barges, like in St. Paul, a lot of that is garbage, like trash, right? And it gets shipped. Although that's becoming a problem because internationally some countries are not buying it anymore. So then we're confronted with that. Then maybe that's a good thing. You don't want that market, but I do think that's a really good thing for us to think about, right? Like what that looks like. And we're seeing, on top of that too, there's also the reality of climate refugees. That's already happening, right? There are climate refugees, and that will just continue to happen. There's a current migrant crisis, right? Some of that is due to political instability, but political instability in part is brought on by climate, right? Economic systems thrust on other countries. Poverty, and those things are all interconnected, right? So in some ways, I also am excited by the idea, right? If people are together in a place, that can also be a way for us to unite around issues, right? So having large populous areas can also provide the people for a movement, right? And I'll note in education, there's been a move for teachers' unions to do something called social movement organizing as a means of labor organizing. And what they do is they focus on broad social community issues as opposed to negotiating like, okay, well, we need a pay raise because, X, Y, Z. And they definitely need pay raises, right? Teachers should be compensated more. But it's a question of connecting that issue to broader concerns that the community has. And I think that's part of the challenge is, if we want like a broad urban environmental movement, it's a question of connecting all of these different needs and issues and helping people connect them, right? And realizing that that's how we can move forward, right? It's not just the issue that you bring to the table, but recognizing how your issue connects with other issues and making that part of the discourse, which I think is changing the conversation a bit. It's, right, we learn to advocate for individual things, right? That's what Suzuki was saying, right? Like we've done really, right? Like we argue for certain things. You know, and that's also even, I mean, that's been a framework for even like with the Chevron deference, right? Like we have agencies that will go for very specific things. And that's important, but maybe that leaves out, you know, viewing things as being more interconnected.
Thank you for your presentation. Lots to think about. One thing that came to my mind is, yes, how humans view the non-human parts of this ecosystem. And you mentioned Salazar, is that the indigenous person who was? Salomon, okay. What I thought about was Robin Wall Kimmerer. Do you know of her? And I read Breeding Sweetgrass, and it's talking about the more indigenous perspective of the tree people and the plant people, and Minnesotans say they love their natural world. I just wondered if you thought that perspective is helpful, or yes, you say you read it, and what your thoughts are.
Well, yeah, I do think it is, and it's interesting, you know, since I'm in education, it's sometimes, you know, there are debates that come about when, you know, and I saw it in Chicago early on. There was a woman named a scholar, Megan Bang, who's I think she's at Northwestern now, but she did this native science project, and essentially she was realizing that American Indian students in Chicago were underperforming in science in pretty drastic ways, and so she did a simple kind of you know, assessment where she had students do you know, like connections of relations. So you'd have one column, you know, and you draw a line from what organisms are most related to the, you know, on the other side, right? And so one of the examples she always liked to provide was you had a human on the one column, and then you either had to connect it to a black bear or a chimpanzee in terms of relationships. A large number of American Indian youth would identify the black bear as being more related to humans. Now that doesn't follow in Western science, right? We know that chimpanzees share 99% of our DNA, we have a common ancestor in that evolutionary story. Some American Indian communities believe that they evolved from bear, right? That bear are ancestors, right? Similar to like orca being ancestors, right? That you know, the Moachit chief could come back as an orca because that's one of their options, right? So even though it's scientifically wrong, it also suggests keener insights into relations and actually an awareness of place. One of the reasons that some students would say that they chose the black bear over chimpanzee as being more related is they've never seen a chimpanzee unless it was in a zoo. They don't belong in North America, right? But black bear do, and these are also youth who are like, and I'm from here too, right? Unlike settler colonialists who aren't ancestrally from here, right? So I do think like that kinship component has history, right? There's a reason that there's this notion of kinship. It even comes up with you know, rocks. Some American Indian languages refer to rocks in ways that combine them as biotic, right? Part of the living organisms, right? And then there are, you know, like then you'll read like a physics paper that says, well, rocks are actually moving, right? And that's one of the qualifiers for life, right? It's got to be something that moves. So even in Western science, right, there's some tolerance of it. But I do think that there's this, there still remains this tendency to view that as mythology, right? And it's interesting because coming out of the COVID crisis, the COVID pandemic, we saw there is a lot of value in putting faith in science, right? And we saw people on, you know, largely on the right using those more postmodern appreciations of different types of knowledge systems, I think using it in a detrimental way to undermine science, but you can have both. Right? And I think there is this tendency too right now where we are encouraged to choose one answer, right? like there has to be one way, right? There's one way to do it. There's one, one choice. But if we can hold multiple truths, right? The idea that we can be related to all of these things, and also, right, it's not at a genetic level, right? But it can be more of an ethic, right? But I do think that's an incredibly important perspective, right?
Well, thank you. Although I would like, could you give us one nugget? I'm sitting here going, it's a bleak story you tell, and I don't know how to change the culture. So on the one hand, you're saying, like, let's be more on the margins, and yet at the same time, we are enmeshed in a society, and we can't disentangle ourselves from our lives. So, what's the pill you would give us to help us sleep at night?
Well, aside from Disonex, or
right. I mean, some of us are older and probably a little less comfortable. I mean, I suppose in one way I live on the margin, but I mean, I'm not going to probably be I'm not going to be Reverend Billy or, anyway, yes. At the same time, we are so entangled with the world we live in. And anyway,
yeah.
So what's the pill that we can live with ourselves? And then we're going to go have some wine and beer and refreshments.
I mean, that can function as a pill. I do think that, I find joy in, honestly, one of the reasons, so I generally teach grad students in my work. I direct the grad program in education. So most of my students are adults. They seem to keep getting younger and younger, or I'm getting older and older. But I do, once a year, teach first-year students in the environmental studies program. And I will say that I have a lot of hope, at least these are the students that Augsburg is recruiting. They come in, they may not necessarily know how to do the critiques, but they come in very willing to be critical and open to different ways of living. And I think we do have a more tolerant generation who's and some of that is due to dissatisfaction, right? Like they've seen the great Oz, right? The curtain's been pulled back. They've been duped enough, and they are coming to realize these things. And I think part of that is to not believe some of the narratives out there that, youth are just self-interested or whatever. But I think there's a lot of knowledge in the younger generations. And I think there's a greater appreciation. You see that in some of the movements, right? You see that with Black Lives Matter is generally very much a youth-driven movement. Decentered movements are also quite powerful because then they can appreciate the nuances that exist. And then with the water protectors, that's unique because it's really driven by youth, but it also connects with the elders in a beautiful way, the water protector movement. So I do think that some of the consolation is the work that is being done. And we don't have to be Reverend Billy, but it's heartening to know that there is a Reverend Billy, and that his work is being sustained. He started as a Times Square performer, right? And it was his little shtick, and it turned into a broad, he has a church, right? And it's a bunch of, people who aren't currently on Broadway who form the choir. So it's probably the best choir, I don't know, in all of New York. But it's a church, right? But I do think that there's, I find joy in the critical perspectives that I see youth bringing. And I've noticed a change. They also have been, I think, a lot of younger folks. They lack a lot of the traditional skills that we would expect in academic circles, and that can certainly hamper them. But I think they do bring a really critical spirit. At least I've been finding that, and that's where I find some solace. And then also, I think if you're comfortable with the idea that the earth can continue without us, right? If we care about the idea that maybe community. It's not us who's included in it, you know.
Well, thank you so much again, Jason, for being here. And I invite everyone out into the lobby and for refreshments and more conversation. And Jason told me he'll stick around for a while. So if you want to have some more personal conversation, please do.
Thank you very much.